few years ago, a man arrived early at his gym. It opened at 5 a.m., but he was there at 4:55, shivering in the winter cold. He tried the handle, seemed locked. He pulled again, still seemed locked. He cupped his hands against the glass and saw a staff member inside, but she was looking down at her phone and didn't notice him. He started getting frustrated. Why would they have someone inside but not unlock the door? This is ridiculous, he muttered. The seconds felt like minutes, and the cold felt sharper. By 5:05, he was angry. If they'd just opened the door, I wouldn't be standing out here freezing. Finally, another member walked up. Without hesitation, she pushed the door, and it swung open easily. It never had been locked. The problem wasn't the door, it was the assumption. Now you might wonder, what has that got to do with the passage that we've just read? Well, I'll explain in just a moment, but in that story, the man thought he was being misused. He thought he was being ill-treated. He thought the door was locked because when he pulled it, it wouldn't open. But the problem wasn't outside of him. The problem wasn't any ill treatment he was receiving. The problem was in his own mind, his own assumption that he needed to pull the door and not push it. Well, we might laugh at that man's foolishness, but the truth is, the same can be true with us and God. Sometimes we can be faced with some difficult situation, some difficult circumstance, perhaps even experience some very hard temptation, and our temptation can be to blame God for it. And we can say, why is God allowing this? Why is God causing me to go through this situation? Why is he allowing this temptation? Or even we might even think, why is he tempting me in that way? Why is God putting me in such a situation where I feel I cannot resist, I cannot endure? Well, in this passage, James says that thinking is wrong. That thinking is as wrong as that man who was trying to pull the door instead of push it. Look at verse 16. In verse 16, the Apostle James writes, "Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of firstfruits of his creatures." James says here in verse 16, don't be deceived, my brethren. Don't be deceived, believers. And you might ask, well, what's he saying we shouldn't be deceived about? Well, he tells us earlier in the passage, verse 13. He says, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone." That's what he means in verse 16 when he says, do not be deceived. Don't fall into that trap of thinking that if you are suffering, if you are going through difficulty and temptation, don't blame God for it. Don't accuse God of it. God cannot tempt with evil. Whatever the temptation is, whether it's a temptation to be cowardly or a temptation to lust or a temptation to greed, or whatever the temptation might be, a temptation to be angry and to respond with violence, whenever the temptation is, don't blame God. Look at verse 14. He says, but each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. James is saying, much like with the story I shared at the beginning, the problem doesn't lie outside of us. It doesn't lie with God or with anyone else, actually. The problem is with our own hearts. That's where the temptation to sin starts. It's our own evil desires, and then when circumstances happen around us, our desires can then lead us to sin. As it says in that verse, desire when it's conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, brings forth death. Even silly things, or seemingly silly things. You're in a traffic jam, and you feel your anger rising, and you are angry at this circumstance you are in. But it's not the traffic which is actually causing your anger or your temptation to anger. What's causing your anger is your desire not to have your plans thwarted. You've got places to go, you've got people to see, and that traffic jam is in your way, and it's your desires which is causing the temptation to sin. I also like a little phrase I try to remind myself when I'm in traffic. You're not in traffic, you are traffic. You are part of the problem. It's always good to remember that. But that's just a silly example, and of course it can be in much more serious ways as well. It's our desires, it's our heart, it's our sinful desires inside which lead to sin. Well, not even sinful desires, but just our desires. Our desire to have what we want is what leads to sin. So James says, don't blame God for that. Don't blame God for the circumstances, or don't blame him for the temptation you're feeling. Your circumstances cannot cause you to sin. You do that all by yourself. That's why James says in verse 16, do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. Now, when I first read that verse, I was puzzled by James's reasoning. He says, don't be deceived. God doesn't tempt people. God doesn't tempt us with evil. And instead, he says, verse 17, every good and every perfect gift is from above. Now, what I would have thought James would have said was, God cannot tempt you with evil because everything God does is good. And James does say that, but he says actually more than that. He doesn't just say everything God does is good and therefore he can't tempt you with evil. He goes even further and he says everything that is good comes from God. To put it a different way, God is the one who decides and defines what is good. It's impossible to experience something good unless it's come from God. Let that sink in. Paul says, and James says, force of habit, James says, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights. Think of it like this. It's like light, the light of the sun. Or not even just light of the sun, just light in general. There can be no darkness in light because by definition light is light. It makes no sense to say the dark side of light because light does not have a dark side because it is light. Now light can cast shadows, But the shadows are not caused by the light itself. It's caused by something which is not light. So it is with us. God shines his light upon us. He grants us good gifts, whether we receive them as good or not. What causes the sin is the shadow in us, the evil in our hearts. That is the problem. Or another illustration, think of the sun. And you might say, especially this time of year, the sun causes the frost. But of course, the sun doesn't really cause the frost, does it? What causes the frost is the fact that we are further away from the sun. We are, to some extent, obscured from the sun. The sun shines its light just the same as it always has. What has changed is us, or the globe. That is what is different. That's why James says what he says in verse 17. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. To summarize what James is saying there, he's saying there can be no shadow in God. By definition, there can be no darkness in God. So any darkness that we experience in our own hearts must come from us and not from him. What James is saying here is actually very similar to what the Apostle Paul says in the book of Romans. Paul says, let God be true and every man a liar. In other words, never doubt the truthfulness of God. If there seems to be some contradiction to what man is saying and what God is saying, then pick God every time. Because God is truth, but man can lie. And so what James is encouraging his readers here and his readers here today is when you are faced with various trials, various temptations, don't turn round and blame God. Don't accuse God of sin. Even in the book of Job, I hope no one here is experiencing the suffering that Job experienced, but it's possible you might or you may have done. But what does it say at the end of chapter 2? It says that in all these things, in all these sufferings he experienced, Job didn't sin with his mouth or accuse God falsely. Job went through all this suffering, but he never, at least in those first 2 chapters, he never turns around and says, God, you are to blame, you are unjust. Sadly, the book goes on and Job comes very close to that, if not crossing that line. And what James is teaching us here is don't cross that line. Remember that everything good, whatever is good that you're experiencing, has to have come from God, because he is the definition of what God is. But let's just go back to that illustration at the beginning. That man standing outside in the cold, pulling the door and not pushing it. If that man for a moment had just decided to doubt himself, he could have been in the warm. He could have been enjoying the warmth of that gym. But because he was so sure of his own understanding, because he was so sure that he was right, he was stuck in the cold. Now, the illustration isn't perfect, because that man's assumption was based on his opinion of other people. And other people can be mistaken. Other people can do unkind things. And he assumed that that was the case, that the door was locked because of someone's negligence or someone's ill treatment of him. And sadly, that can happen. So he was somewhat justified in his assumption. Nevertheless, if he had just considered questioning that assumption, if he had just shown a little grace to those inside. If he had just paused to think for a moment and tried pushing the door, he would have been in the warm so much quicker. And how much more true is that true of us? When we question God, we're not questioning someone who can be mistaken. We're not questioning someone who is capable of ill treatment. Everything God does is perfect and right and just. We can never complain at anything God does, because everything he does is right. So when we're tempted to do that, when we're tempted to blame God, the lesson is we need to pause. We need to consider maybe, just maybe, it's my assumptions which are wrong here. Maybe it's my mind which is deceiving me and not God. And in fact, that's actually exactly what James encourages us to do in the next verse. Look at verse 19. James says, "So then, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear," and that's every woman as well, just in case you're wondering. "Let everyone be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God." Go back to that traffic jam. That person eaten up by their own desires and impatient because that traffic jam is blocking their desires, and they're getting angrier and angrier. And let's suppose that in a moment of rage they fly out the car and they attack the car ahead. You see, the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. That's what happens when we give our desires their head. It leads, ultimately, to death. In fact, that's exactly what James said earlier, wasn't it? Did you notice what he said in verse 14? "Each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then, when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death." Take any sin at all, any sin that you've committed or someone else has committed, and if you bring it down, if you bring it back, you'll find it was because of some desire in that person's heart that they wanted to be fulfilled, or which they feared was not going to be fulfilled. And always it leads to death. But wonderfully, James describes the opposite as well. Did you notice what he said in verse 18? I'll read from verse 17. He says, "Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of firstfruits of his creatures." Now, verse 18 is the mirror image, if you like, of verse 15. In verse 15, James says our desires can give birth to sin, and sin leads to death. But in verse 18, James says that God brought us forth. In verse 14, it was our desires which bring forth sin, but in verse 18 it says God's desires brought forth us. In one sense, you can see that as being when God created us. All of us are the creation of God, through various means, of course, but we are the creation of God. And that was God's desire, God's wish. But more importantly, it's the new birth. If you're a believer here this morning, you've been brought forth, you've been, if I can put it this way, given birth to by God, by God's will. By God's desire. You didn't deserve it. You didn't do anything to earn it. It was God's grace that he made you alive, if you are a believer this morning. That was God's desire, and that brought forth life in our souls, so that we don't anymore need to live for our own desires, but we can live for God's desires which leads to life. And that's the big choice before all of us this morning. Will we choose our own desires and death, or God's desires and life? That's the choice every human being faces. We can see it actually in the Christmas story. This is the Christmas twist to this message. In the Christmas story, do you remember Mary? And the angel Gabriel gives her astonishing, bewildering message. He says to her that she's going to give birth to a son, and this son will be the Saviour of the world. Now, I can imagine some young women responding to that news with utter confusion and perhaps even anger. This could have been very inconvenient to Mary's plans. It was inconvenient to Mary's plans. She wasn't at this point married. She was engaged to Joseph. And this was a whole new situation, to put it mildly, to lay on her shoulders. But how did she respond? She could have responded with anger. She could have responded with unbelief, like Zacharias did, you remember, at the beginning of Luke's Gospel, when he was told that his wife would have a baby. But instead, she says, I am the servant of the Lord. May it be to me as he has said. She submits to the will of God. It may not have been in line with her desires, but she submitted to the greater wisdom of God, and ultimately experienced greater joy as a result, though we have to say it came through sorrow. Simeon told Mary that a sword would pierce her own heart, and no doubt referring to the fact that that son she was about to give birth to would one day die on a cross, and she would have to endure the death of her son. But remember, 3 days later, she enjoyed his resurrection. And out of sorrow came great joy. And that is always the way when we follow God's will and not our own. It might be painful in the moment. It might be difficult. It might hurt to some extent. But it always leads to life in the end. The opposite is exemplified by King Herod. Remember King Herod, the king of the Jews? And he hears the news that a new king has been born in Bethlehem. And how does he respond? With worship? With praise? With submission to the will of God? No. He finds out when the baby was born. He finds out where the baby is to be born. And he sends out soldiers to kill the baby. And not only the baby, but anyone, any child of similar age in the whole region of Bethlehem. Why? Because of his own desires. His own desire for power. His own desire for prestige and honor, which he thought this baby would take away from him. And in a very real way, his desire gave birth to sin, which brought forth death. Death to others, certainly, but ultimately to himself as well. Not just physical death, but eternal death. He desperately clung to his crown, and he lost it all anyway. Mary submitted her life to God, and she received, you could say, the greatest honor that any woman has ever received. That is the lesson from this passage. Let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. Doubt your desires. Don't trust your desires. We have a whole mess of desires within us, don't we? Some desires are good, some desires are bad. We cannot simply trust them. We cannot afford to rely on our own understanding alone. We have to listen to God. We have to trust him. And if we listen to God's desires and let God's desires shape ours, we will find life in the end. And that's a particularly important message today, isn't it? Our society which we live in is one which is in many ways slave to its desires. Whatever desire someone feels, no matter how contrary to reason it is encouraged. People are encouraged to follow their heart wherever their heart might lead, to trust themselves, believe in themselves. James says, God says no. Doing that alone will lead to death. Doing that alone will lead to sin. Instead, take God's desires. Listen to him. Take guidance from him, and you will find life. Not just now, but for eternity. What does the book of Proverbs say? Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. I can't think of a better summary of what James is teaching in these verses. And with those thoughts in mind, I've chosen as our last hymn, a hymn which actually refers back to one of these verses. It's the only one which isn't a carol, I'm afraid, this morning, but I trust you'll see why I've chosen it. Number 86, Great is thy faithfulness, O God, my Father. And this is the line, there is no shadow of turning with thee, which is taken from the verses we've read. Thou changest not, thy compassions they fail not. As thou hast been, thou forever wilt be. So let's close this part of the service by singing number 86.